They entered the courtroom for a legal robbery, not justice. My sister clutched a Hermes bag worth my annual salary, staring at me like dirt. While my parents waited to carve up grandfather's fortune, they mistook my silence for weakness, believing I was just the estranged daughter. They were wrong. They did not notice the empty chair reserved for a verdict decided long ago. When the doors opened, I knew this was not a hearing to divide assets. It was a trap. My name is Ren Silverton, and I had spent the last decade of my life ensuring that history was preserved, binding cracking spines and smoothing out dog-eared pages of books that everyone else had forgotten. I was a restorer. I fixed things that were broken. But as I sat in the stifling, artificially cooled air of the King County Probate Court, I knew that some things were beyond repair. My family was one of them. The courtroom, located in the brutalist gray heart of downtown Seattle, smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. It was a room designed to intimidate, with its high ceilings and rows of empty wooden benches, but the people sitting at the table to my right seemed entirely immune to the gravity of the setting. To them, this was not a place of judgment. It was merely a transaction hub, a place to sign papers and collect what they believed was divinely owed to them. My sister, Blair, sat closest to the center aisle. She was a study in calculated optics. She wore a bespoke suit in a shade of ivory so pale it was almost blinding, a color chosen specifically to suggest purity, innocence, and a lack of guile. It was a masterpiece of tailoring that likely cost more than $12,000. Draped over her shoulders like armor, her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek bun, exposing a neck that looked fragile and vulnerable. It was a lie. There was nothing fragile about Blair. She turned her head slightly, catching my eye, and the corner of her mouth twitched. It was a micro-expression, lasting less than a second, a smirk of absolute predatory confidence before it smoothed back into the mask of the grieving, dutiful granddaughter. I looked down at my own attire. I wore a simple black dress, high-necked and long-sleeved, bought off the rack at a department store 3 years ago. I had no jewelry, no makeup to hide the dark circles under my eyes. I looked exactly like what they wanted the judge to see, the mousy, tired, incapable spinster who had spent too much time in a dusty house with a dying old man. "Your Honor, we are looking at a classic case of undue influence," Vance Sterling said. His voice was rich and baritone, a voice that sounded like it cost $400 an hour, which, coincidentally, was exactly what he charged. Sterling stood before the bench, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, elegant motion. He was handsome in the way television lawyers were handsome, sharp jawline, silver foxy hair at the temples, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have here a young woman, Ms. Ren Silverton, who has no employment history outside of freelance book repair, a hobby. Really, not a career. She has no assets. She has lived rent-free in the deceased's home for 5 years, and now she presents a handwritten will, supposedly drafted in the final. Confused weeks of Arthur Silverton's life, granting her control over an estate valued at over $85 million. Judge Harrison peered over his spectacles. He was a man of stone and statute, with deep lines etched around a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled since 1995. He shuffled the papers before him, the rustling sound echoing in the silent room. "Proceed. Mr. Sterling." "Thank you, Your Honor." Sterling continued, pacing slowly toward my side of the room, invading my personal space just enough to be unsettling. "The Silverton family parents, Richard and Eleonora, and Sister Blair are successful, established members of the Seattle business community. They have the acumen to manage the Silverton legacy. Ren, on the other hand," he paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "Ren was merely the caregiver, and while we appreciate her service, we cannot ignore the reality that isolation breeds manipulation. Arthur Silverton was 92 years old. He was vulnerable, he was lonely, and he was taken advantage of." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I did not speak. My hands were folded in my lap. clutching an object so tightly that the edges dug into my palm. It was grandfather's fountain pen, not the gold-plated one he used for signing contracts, but the battered black resin one he used for his journals. It was the only thing I had taken from his desk the morning he died. Sterling's words faded into a dull buzz as my mind was pulled backward, away from the sterile courtroom and into the biting cold of a rainy afternoon just 4 days ago. The memory hit me with the physical force of a blow. It was the parking lot of the funeral home. The sky was a bruised purple, and the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the asphalt into a slick, black mirror. I had just watched them lower grandfather's casket into the wet earth. I was shivering, not from the cold, but from a hollow, aching grief that felt like it had scooped out my insides. I was walking toward my old sedan when a black SUV cut me off, tires screeching on the wet pavement. The window rolled down. It was my father. "Richard." "Get in," he had said. It wasn't an invitation. I stood there, the rain soaking through my coat. "I'm going home, Dad." "That house isn't your home, Wren." "Not anymore." My mother, Eleonora, leaned over from the passenger seat. Her face was perfect, untouched by the rain or tears. "Get in the car. We need to settle this now." I didn't move. My father slammed the door open and stepped out. He was a large man, once imposing, now just soft and red-faced from too much scotch and too much stress. He loomed over me, blocking the streetlight. He shoved a damp document against my chest. "Sign it," he hissed, his voice low so the other mourners getting into their cars wouldn't hear. "It's a waiver. You relinquish any claim to the estate, and we'll give you a stipend, $5,000 a month, generous, more than you'll ever make gluing old paper together." "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't be stupid," my mother called out from the dry warmth of the car. "We're doing this for you. You can't handle the pressure. Wren, you're weak. You've always been the weak one. Do you think Arthur wanted you to run a shipping empire? He kept you around because he pitied you." "He kept me around because I loved him," I whispered. My father laughed, a harsh barking sound. "He was senile. Wren, he didn't know who you were half the time. You were just a nurse to him. Now sign the damn paper." I looked at the document, blurring under the raindrops. I looked at my father's face, twisted in greed and impatience, and for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink away. I stepped back. "No," I said. My father's face went purple. He took a step toward me, his hand raising slightly as if to grab my arm. But then he saw a group of people exiting the funeral home. He lowered his hand, straightening his tie. "You'll regret this," he spat, rain dripping from his nose. "We will bury you in court. Wren, you'll walk away with nothing, not even the clothes on your back." "Ms. Silverton." The judge's voice snapped me back to the present. The air conditioning felt suddenly freezing on my skin. "I asked if you have a response to Mr. Sterling's opening statement. You are representing yourself, correct?" I cleared my throat. It felt dry, like sandpaper. "Yes, Your Honor. I am representing myself." "And your response?" Judge Harrison asked. Looking at his watch, he clearly wanted lunch. "I have no opening statement at this time," I said quietly. A ripple of laughter went through the bench where my parents sat. My mother, Eleonora, shook her head theatrically, whispering something to my father. Vance Sterling smirked, turning back to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor," Sterling said, spreading his hands wide. "She has no defense because there is no defense. Now, if I may, I would like to call Blair Silverton to the stand to testify regarding the decedent's mental state." Blair walked to the witness stand with the grace of a dancer. She took the oath, her voice clear and melodious. When she sat down, she looked small, fragile, a grieving granddaughter trying to do the right thing. "Ms. Silverton," Sterling asked gently, "describe your grandfather's condition in the last 6 months." Blair took a shuddering breath. She reached into her Hermes bag and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that were perfectly dry. "It was heartbreaking," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "Grandfather Arthur was a giant of a man, but toward the end, he didn't know where he was. He would call me by my mother's name. He would talk about business deals that closed 20 years ago as if they were happening today." She looked directly at the judge, her eyes wide and imploring. "Wren, my sister controlled access to him. When I tried to visit, she would say he was sleeping, or that he didn't want to see anyone. She isolated him. She made him believe that we had abandoned him. It was the only way she could get him to sign those papers." I sat frozen. It was a lie so complete, so audacious, that it took my breath away. Blair hadn't visited in 3 years, not once. When grandfather called her on her birthday, she had sent him to voicemail. I felt the old fountain pen digging into my skin, the pain grounding me. Breathe. I told myself, just breathe. "He was confused," Blair continued, a tear finally tracking down her cheek, a single, perfect tear. "He thought Wren was the only one left. It wasn't his fault. It was the dementia and the manipulation." Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically. "He was buying it. Why wouldn't he? Blair was the CEO of a tech fashion startup. She was on the cover of local magazines. She was success personified. I was nobody." "Thank you, Ms. Silverton," Sterling said softly. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, based on the clear evidence of mental incapacity and undue influence, we move for a summary judgment. We ask that the handwritten will be declared void and that the court immediately transfer full control of the Silverton Corporation and all real estate holdings to the next of kin. Richard and Eleonora Silverton, with Blair Silverton acting as executor." The room went silent. This was it. The ambush. They weren't just asking for a trial. They were asking for an execution. They wanted it over now, before I could even file a proper objection, before anyone could look too closely at the books. Judge Harrison leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at me. His gaze was dismissive. "Ms. Silverton, unless you can produce immediate, concrete evidence that your grandfather was of sound mind, medical records that predate this so-called will, or witnesses who are not yourself, I am inclined to grant the motion. The assets of the Silverton Corporation are significant and require competent management. We cannot leave a $100 million company in limbo." My parents were already leaning forward, barely suppressing their glee. My father was practically vibrating. Blair was wiping her eyes, hiding a smile behind her handkerchief. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:14 in the morning. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my spine was straight. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that made everyone jump. "Objection," I said. My voice was not loud, but it didn't shake. Judge Harrison sighed, taking off his glasses. "On what grounds? Ms. Silverton, do you have the medical records?" "No, Your Honor," I said. "Do you have a witness?" "No, Your Honor." "Then sit down," the judge snapped. "You are wasting the court's time." "I object," I said, raising my voice slightly. "Because the file you are reading is incomplete." Sterling laughed, a short, derisive sound. "Incomplete. We have submitted hundreds of pages of financial documents, medical opinions from experts who reviewed his file, and character witness statements. The file is quite complete, Ms. Silverton." "It is missing the primary document," I said, looking straight at Blair. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "What document?" Judge Harrison asked, his patience evaporating. "If you have evidence, submit it. Otherwise, I am ruling." I looked down at the table, then back up at the judge. I didn't have the document. I didn't have the power to stop them, but I knew who did. I looked at the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom. They were closed. Silence stretched out, agonizing and thin. "Ms. Silverton," the judge barked. "What are you waiting for?" I looked at the clock again. 10:15, right on time. I turned back to the judge. clutching the pen so hard I thought it might snap. "I am waiting," I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent room. "For the keeper of the key." The judge slammed his gavel down with a sound that cracked through the stagnant air of the courtroom like a gunshot. 15 minutes. That was all the time he was willing to grant. 15 minutes for the mystery key holder to materialize, or else he would sign the order that would strip me of everything and hand the Silverton Empire over to the wolves sitting at the plaintiff's table. As the bailiff announced the recess, the courtroom doors swung open, and the tension that had been contained within the four walls spilled out into the hallway. I tried to walk toward the water fountain, needing to wash the taste of stale coffee and anxiety out of my mouth, but I never made it. They moved with the coordinated precision of a pack of velociraptors who had spotted a limping gazelle. The hallway was lined with polished marble that amplified every footstep, every whisper, turning the space into an echo chamber of judgment. My family did not just approach me, they engulfed me. Eleonora, my mother, reached me first, up close. The cracks in her foundation were visible beneath the layers of expensive foundation and setting powder. She smelled of tuberose and aggressive denial. She did not grab my arm. That would have been too plebeian, too visible to the bystanders pretending not to watch. Instead, she stepped into my personal space, her voice dropping to a hiss that was far more terrifying than a scream. "You are embarrassing us," she said. Her teeth clenched so tightly I wondered if her porcelain veneers might shatter. "Do you have any idea what you look like in there? Like a petulant child throwing a tantrum because she didn't get the toy she wanted? Arthur would be mortified." The invocation of my grandfather's name was her favorite weapon, a bludgeon she used to beat me into submission whenever I strayed from her script. "Grandfather isn't here to be mortified." "Mother," I replied, my voice steady despite the rapid thumping of my heart against my ribs. "And if he were, I don't think I am the one he would be disappointed in. Don't you dare speak for him." My father, Richard, cut in. He loomed over Eleonora's shoulder, his face a mask of red-veined fury. He adjusted his silk tie, a nervous tic I had watched him develop over years of hiding failing investments. "You think because you changed his bedpans and read him poetry that you understand this family's legacy. You are a librarian, Wren, a glorified bookbinder." "I am a conservator," I corrected him. "I save history. I don't sell it." Richard stepped closer, using his height to intimidate, a tactic that had worked when I was 12 but lost its potency now that I knew exactly how small he truly was on the inside. "Listen to me closely. If you do not walk back into that courtroom and withdraw your objection, I will make sure you never touch a rare book again in this city. I know people on the board of every museum, every library, every private collection from here to Portland. I will paint you as unstable. I will tell them you stole from the estate. You will be lucky to get a job gluing paperbacks at a community center." It was a valid threat. In the insular world of antiquarian book restoration, reputation was currency, and my father had just threatened to bankrupt me. But what Richard failed to realize was that when you have already mourned the only person who ever loved you, threats against your career feel strangely hollow. I looked past him to Blair. My sister was hanging back slightly, typing furiously on her phone. Her knuckles were white, the cool, collected CEO who had just wept a single. Perfect tear on the witness stand was gone. In her place was a woman on the verge of a catastrophic structural failure. I knew why. The family thought I spent my days in the dim light of grandfather's study just reading novels. But Arthur Silverton had taught me to read more than just books. He had taught me to read ledgers. He had taught me to read people. Blair wasn't just greedy, she was drowning. Her fashion startup, Lumina, was a beautiful, shiny shell with nothing inside but debt. She had leveraged her projected inheritance to secure massive loans for a real estate development in South Lake Union, a project that had stalled 6 months ago due to zoning violations she had tried to bribe her way out of. The loans were coming due. Not next year, not next month, tomorrow. If she didn't get control of the Silverton liquid assets by the end of business day, the banks would seize everything. Worse, The private investors she had courted, men who did not file lawsuits but broke kneecaps, would come looking for their money. She needed this judgment today. She needed it like a starving animal needs meat. The realization made me feel a surge of pity, quickly extinguished by the memory of her testimony. She had called him senile. She had erased him. My mind flashed back to a Tuesday evening, 3 months before grandfather passed. The rain had been hammering against the library windows, a relentless Seattle drumbeat. Grandfather was sitting in his leather armchair, a blanket over his knees, watching the fire. I had just hung up the phone with Richard, who had called to scream about grandfather refusing to sign a power of attorney document. "They say you're losing it, Grandpa," I had told him, pouring him a cup of tea. "Dad says you don't know what day it is." Arthur Silverton had turned to me, his blue eyes sharp and clear, twinkling with a mischievous intelligence that defied his 92 years. He took a sip of tea and winked. "Let them think it. Wren," he had rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "It is a tactical advantage. When people think you are blind, they show you exactly who they are. They stop hiding their knives." He had reached out and taken my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Money is a magnifying glass. My dear, it does not change people. It simply shows you a giant version of who they already are. Your father is a giant bully. Your sister is a giant narcissist. And you," he had squeezed my hand, "you are the spine of this book. You hold the pages together even when they try to tear themselves apart." "I'm not strong like you," I had whispered. "You are stronger," he had said, "because you don't need the applause." The memory faded as Vance Sterling, the lawyer with the $400 haircut, chuckled, pulling me back to the cold, fluorescent hallway. "Touching family reunion," Sterling said, checking his Rolex. It was a gold Daytona, flashy and desperate. "Look, Ms. Silverton, let's be pragmatic. You are stalling. I don't know who this key keeper is that you invented, but unless it is the ghost of Christmas past, Judge Harrison is not going to care. You are delaying the inevitable and costing the estate thousands in legal fees. Why not take the stipend? $5,000 a month is a lot of money for someone with your lifestyle." My lifestyle. He meant my solitude. He meant my lack of Hermes bags. "I am not stalling. Mr. Sterling," I said, meeting his gaze. "I am waiting for the truth." Sterling rolled his eyes. "The truth is what can be proven in court, and right now, the proof says you are a manipulator who preyed on a dying man." Blair finally looked up from her phone. She shoved it into her pocket and stepped forward, pushing past our parents. She stood so close to me that I could see the tiny beads of sweat trapped in the fine hairs of her upper lip. Her facade was slipping. "Listen to me, you little leech," she whispered, her voice low enough that only I could hear. It was an ugly sound, stripped of all her media-trained polish. "You think you're special because you sat there and wiped his drool. You were a servant. That is all you were. Paid help without the paycheck. I am the heir. I am the one who builds things. I am the Silverton name. You are just a footnote." "A footnote can change the meaning of the entire text," I said. Blair's eyes narrowed. "He laughed at you. You know, when he was lucid, he told Dad that he only kept you around because no one else would marry you." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. I knew every conversation Grandfather had had in the last 5 years because I was there. But it still stung, sharp and precise, designed to hit my deepest insecurity. Before I could respond, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned open. The bailiff, a burly man with a face like a bulldog, stepped out. "Court is back in session," he bellowed. "All parties return immediately." My father straightened his jacket, shooting me one last look of disgust. "Last chance. Wren, don't be a fool." Eleonora smoothed her skirt, her face instantly composing itself into the mask of the tragic. Dignified mother. "We pray you make the right choice, darling." They turned and walked back into the courtroom, a united front of greed and entitlement. Vance Sterling gave me a pitying wink before following them. I stood alone in the hallway for a second. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I felt the weight of the fountain pen in my pocket. I felt the ghost of my grandfather's hand in mine. Money is a magnifying glass. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of floor wax and injustice, and walked back through the doors. The courtroom felt different now. The air was thinner. The judge looked angrier. Judge Harrison was already writing something on his notepad. His brow furrowed. "Ms. Silverton," the judge boomed as I took my seat at the empty defense table. "The recess is over, unless your mysterious witness has materialized out of thin air. I am issuing my ruling." He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the empty gallery behind me. "There is no one here," Harrison said, his voice dripping with finality. As I suspected, this was a delay tactic, and a poorly executed one at that. "Your Honor," Vance Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket, radiating victory. "We ask that the court not only grant the summary judgment, but also consider sanctions against Ms. Silverton for wasting the court's valuable time." "I am inclined to agree," the judge said. He picked up his pen. It was a Mont Blanc, thick and black. He hovered it over the document that would hand my grandfather's life's work to a woman who planned to liquidate it to cover a gambling debt disguised as a business strategy. "I rule in favor of the plaintiffs," the judge began, the tip of his pen touching the paper. "The estate of Arthur Silverton is hereby—" My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the door. "Please." Blair turned to me, her smile wide and triumphant, her eyes screaming, "I told you so." And then, I felt it. A shift in the air pressure, a vibration in the floorboards. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at my sister. I looked at the double doors at the back of the room. "Wait," I whispered, but the judge didn't hear me. He was signing the first letter of his name. The ink from Judge Harrison's Mont Blanc pen had barely grazed the surface of the court order when the atmosphere in the room shattered. It did not break with a bang or a shout. It broke with the heavy, hydraulic sigh of the double doors at the back of the courtroom swinging open. It was not the bailiff returning. It was not a lost tourist or a late clerk. The man who stepped across the threshold moved with the kind of kinetic silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", and appeared to be roughly 35 years old. He wore a black suit that absorbed the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom rather than reflecting them. It was a suit of terrifying quality, cut so precisely to his frame that it made Vance Sterling's expensive Italian tailoring look like a costume rental. There was no briefcase in his hand. There was no laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He carried only a single, thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored parchment, sealed not with glue, but with a disc of crimson wax stamped with an intricate crest. He did not look at me. He did not look at my parents, who had twisted in their seats to gawk. He did not look at Blair, whose triumphant smile was beginning to curdle into a look of mild confusion. He walked straight down the center aisle, his dress shoes making a sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack on the linoleum floor that sounded like a countdown. The silence that descended on the room was absolute. It was the silence of a predator entering a clearing. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Vance Sterling was the first to recover his voice, though it lacked its usual oily confidence. He stepped out from behind the plaintiff's table, moving to intercept the stranger in the aisle. It was a territorial move, the alpha male trying to assert dominance over his hunting ground. "Excuse me," Vance barked, holding up a hand. "Who do you think you are? This is a closed hearing. You cannot just waltz in here while the judge is issuing a ruling." The man in the black suit did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He simply adjusted his trajectory by 2 inches, bypassing Vance as if the lawyer were a piece of furniture, a coat rack that had been inconveniently placed in the middle of the room. Vance was left standing there, hand raised to empty air, looking foolish and small. The stranger walked through the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He approached the bench with a stride that suggested he owned the building. the land it stood on, and the air we were all breathing. Judge Harrison looked up, his pen still hovering over the paper. His expression shifted from annoyance to something sharper, something wary. He was a man who knew the hierarchy of power in this city, and he recognized instantly that the man standing before him was not a participant in the usual legal circus. The stranger stopped directly in front of the bench, up close. His profile was sharp, almost cruel in its symmetry. He had dark hair, neatly groomed, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He placed the heavy cream envelope on the high wooden ledge of the judge's bench. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was soft, a whisper of friction, yet it echoed like a gavel strike. Sovereign Trust and Fiduciary Group exercises intervention rights under Article 11, the man said. His voice was a shock. It was not loud, but it possessed a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was a voice devoid of inflection, devoid of pleading or persuasion. It was the voice of a man who stated facts, not arguments. I saw Judge Harrison's eyes drop to the envelope. I saw his gaze lock onto the crimson wax seal. And then, I saw the blood drain from his face. It was a subtle reaction, a micro-expression of genuine alarm that I had never expected to see on the face of a superior court judge. His hand, the one holding the pen, lowered slowly to the desk. He capped the pen. It was a gesture of surrender. Sovereign Trust, Judge Harrison repeated, his voice losing its booming authority. I was not aware I had no notification that the trust was a party to this matter. You are now, the man said. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked at the man's back, at the impeccable line of his shoulders. Who was he I had spent 5 years organizing every scrap of paper in my grandfather's study? I knew every accountant, every lawyer, every bank manager he had dealt with since 1980. I had never seen this man before. I had never heard of Sovereign Trust, but my sister had, or rather, she sensed the shift in the wind. Dad, Blair whispered loudly, leaning over the back of her chair to clutch at our father's sleeve. What is he talking about? What is Sovereign Trust? My father looked bewildered. He was a businessman of the old school, used to country clubs and handshake deals, but he was small time compared to the sharks of global finance. I don't know, he hissed back. Some investment firm, probably just a creditor. It is not just a firm, Vance Sterling muttered, walking back to his table but remaining standing. He looked rattled. He was staring at the envelope on the judge's bench with a look of naked greed mixed with apprehension. Sovereign Trust is a ghost. They handle wealth that doesn't want to be found. Old money, the kind of money that buys governments. Blair's face tightened. She stood up, her ivory suit gleaming under the lights, and pointed a manicured finger at the stranger's back. I don't care who he is, she announced, her voice shrill, cracking the heavy tension in the room. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have a ruling. This man has no standing here. He hasn't even identified himself. The man in the black suit turned. It was a slow, deliberate pivot. He turned his back on the judge, a move that would have earned anyone else a contempt citation, and faced the plaintiff's table. For the first time, I saw his face clearly. He was devastatingly handsome, but in a way that made you want to step back rather than lean in. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. He looked at Vance Sterling, then he looked at my parents, and finally, his gaze landed on Blair. He looked at her not with anger, but with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly dull specimen of insect. Julian Thorne, he said, Senior Auditor for the Sovereign Trust. Blair crossed her arms, trying to summon the CEO persona that had dazzled the venture capitalists. Well, Mr. Thorne, you are late. The judge was just signing the order giving me control of the Silverton estate, so unless you have a claim against my grandfather's debts, you can leave. Julian Thorne did not blink. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a chess master who sees mate in one. Blair Silverton, he said. He spoke her name as if it were a mild unpleasantness he had to address. You seem to be laboring under a significant misunderstanding. You are fighting for control of the Silverton Corporation. You are fighting for the deeds to the abyssal estate in the Highlands. You are fighting for the accounts at Chase and Bank of America. Yes, Blair snapped. My inheritance. Thorne tilted his head slightly. There is no inheritance to fight for. Ms. Silverton, not in this court, and certainly not in probate. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My father stood up slowly, his face flushing a deep, unhealthy red. What the hell are you saying? My father founded that company. He owned those properties. He did, Thorne acknowledged coolly. Until 5 years ago. He took a step toward Blair. Just one step, but it made her flinch back. 5 years ago, Thorne continued, his voice smooth and relentless. Arthur Silverton realized that the vultures were circling. He knew his son was incompetent. He knew his granddaughter was hungry, Blair gasped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. So, Thorne said, he dissolved his personal ownership of every single asset, the company, the houses, the cars, the art collection, even the copyright to his memoirs. He transferred everything 100% of his worldly wealth into an irrevocable blind trust managed by Sovereign. That's a lie, Vance Sterling shouted, though he sounded desperate now. We have the title deeds. We have the tax returns. You have paperwork for shell entities, Thorne said, dismissing him with a glance. Decoys. The real assets have been insulated within the Sovereign vault for half a decade. Arthur Silverton died a pauper on paper. He owned nothing. Which means this court. Thorne turned back to Judge Harrison, gesturing vaguely at the room. Has no jurisdiction over the assets in question. There is nothing to probating. There is nothing to divide. A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't just a sound. It was the physical sensation of the air being sucked out of the space. My mother let out a low, strangled moan and slumped back against the bench. My father looked as if he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. But Blair looked like a statue cracking. Her entire reality, the future she had leveraged, the debts she had hidden, the empire she thought she had won, it was all dissolving in front of her eyes. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice trembling. He was senile. He couldn't have done that. He didn't have the capacity. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Arthur Silverton was the sharpest man I have ever met, Thorne said softly. And he anticipated this moment with terrifying precision. He knew you would claim incapacity. He knew you would try to steal what you did not earn. Thorne turned back to the bench. He nodded at the envelope. Open it, Your Honor. Judge Harrison stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. His hands shook slightly. He picked up a silver letter opener. This, the judge murmured, mostly to himself, changes everything. The sound of the heavy paper tearing was loud, violent, and final. Reap! I sat frozen in my chair, my hands still clutching the edge of the table. I looked at Julian Thorne's back. He stood perfectly still, a pillar of darkness in the center of the chaos he had just unleashed. He hadn't looked at me yet, not once, but as the judge pulled the documents out of the envelope, I felt a strange, electric sensation run down my spine. My grandfather hadn't just left me a pen. He had left me a weapon, and he had sent a soldier to wield it. Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles, the wire frames catching the harsh overhead light as he scrutinized the documents Julian Thorne had placed before him. The sound of pages turning was the only noise in the room, sharp and dry like dead leaves scraping against pavement. I watched the judge's face. I had become an expert at reading silent cues the way glue dried on a spine, the way paper buckled under humidity, and I saw the shift in his demeanor. The aggression he had directed at me earlier was gone, replaced by the furrowed brow of a legal scholar realizing he had nearly made a catastrophic error in judgment. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, without looking up. His voice was no longer booming. It was quiet, dangerous. Are you familiar with the concept of an inter vivos transfer? Vance Sterling stood, smoothing his tie, though his hands were not quite steady. I am, Your Honor. It refers to a transfer of property made during a person's lifetime. However, we contend that any such transfer made by Arthur Silverton was done under duress or while he was mentally incapacitated. Save your arguments for a moment, the judge snapped. He looked at Thorne. Counselor or Mr. Auditor, I should say, please explain the structure outlined in Exhibit A to the court. Julian Thorne stepped forward. He did not lean on the podium. He stood with the relaxed posture of a man who knows the structural integrity of the bridge he is standing on. Thank you, Your Honor, Thorne said. His voice was cool, precise, and stripped of all theatricality. On February 12, 2021, Arthur Silverton executed a blind, irrevocable trust. At that moment, the legal title to all his assets, including the controlling shares of Silverton Shipping, the real estate portfolio, and his liquid capital was transferred from Arthur Silverton, the individual, to the sovereign trust, the entity. Thorne paused, letting the weight of the date sink in. 2021, Thorne repeated. That is 5 years prior to his death. At that time, Mr. Silverton was still sitting on the board of 3 charities and piloting his own boat. There was no dementia. There was no nursing care. The transfer was absolute. Vance Sterling looked like he had swallowed a lemon. But the will, he stammered. We have a will dated from last month. The will is valid, Thorne conceded, nodding slightly. It is a perfectly legal document. However, it governs the distribution of Arthur Silverton's personal estate at the time of his death. Since all significant assets were moved into the trust 5 years ago, the estate covered by that will consist roughly of his used clothing, a few toothbrushes, and perhaps the contents of his refrigerator. I felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in my chest. Grandfather had played them. He had let them fight over a treasure chest that he had emptied half a decade ago. This is a shell game, Vance shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Thorne. This is constructive fraud, my client. Blair Silverton is the rightful heir. She was the court-appointed guardian. She had a reasonable expectation of inheritance. Thorne turned his head slowly to look at Vance. It was the movement of a tank turret acquiring a target. Let us discuss that claim, Thorne said. You stated earlier, and Ms. Blair Silverton testified under oath that she was the primary caregiver and guardian. She was his granddaughter, Vance said, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. She oversaw his care. Incorrect, Thorne said. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sleek, black flash drive. He placed it on the court clerk's desk. This drive contains the digitized visitor logs and security camera metadata from the Silverton residence for the last 24 months. The system was installed and monitored by Sovereign Security Services. Thorne turned to look directly at Blair. She was pale, her lips parted in silent horror. The logs are quite illuminating, Thorne continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even harder. In the last 6 months of Arthur Silverton's life, the period where you claim he was confused and you were comforting him, the number of times you entered the property is exactly 0. That's not true, Blair whispered. But her voice lacked all conviction. The cameras do not lie, Ms. Silverton, Thorne said. They show only one person by his side. They show one person administering medication, one person reading to him, one person sleeping in the chair next to his bed when the pneumonia set in. He gestured toward me without looking at me. Wren Silverton. This is irrelevant, Vance interrupted, trying to regain control of the narrative. Visits or no visits, the bloodline is what matters. The trust must be broken. It is against public policy to disinherit a direct descendant in favor of a shadowy corporation. The corporation does not own the money, Thorne corrected him. We manage it for the beneficiary, and that brings us to the most critical document in the file, the trap. Judge Harrison looked up sharply. The trap. Clause 47, subsection C, Thorne said. also known as the no contest, or in terrorem clause, Your Honor. Would you be so kind as to read it into the record? Judge Harrison flipped through the heavy parchment pages until he found the section. He adjusted his glasses again. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway outside. The judge began to read, his voice grave. I, Arthur Silverton, being of sound mind, hereby declare that the peace and stability of my beneficiary is paramount. Therefore, if any potential heir, family member, or interested party seeks to challenge the validity of this trust, or attempts to claim assets held by this trust through probate court litigation, or creates legal distress for the appointed beneficiary. The judge paused. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Blair. Then that individual shall be immediately and permanently excluded from any and all distributions from this trust. Furthermore, any prior gifts, loans, or allowances provided to said individual shall be immediately recalled and treated as debt owed to the trust, due upon demand. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, crushing. It was the sound of a guillotine blade hitting the block. Blair did not scream. She did not cry. She simply collapsed back into her chair as if her strings had been cut. Her eyes were wide and unseeing. She had not just lost the $85 million. She had not just lost the company. Silverton, sit down, or I will have you removed. It is a forgery, Richard yelled, ignoring the judge. He lunged toward the railing that separated the gallery from the court. That man is a fraud. He's an actor hired by Wren. Julian Thorne did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply reached into the envelope again. It seemed bottomless. A magician's hat of legal nightmares, and pulled out another document. We anticipated the accusation of undue influence and lack of capacity, Thorne said, his voice cutting through my father's shouting like a razor through silk. He held up a thick, bound report. This is a capacity evaluation conducted on the day the trust was signed. It was performed by Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation the leading geriatric psychiatrist at the University of Washington. It includes a full cognitive assessment, an MRI scan of the brain showing no signs of vascular dementia at that time, and a video interview. Thorne placed the report on the judge's bench. Furthermore, Thorne added, looking at my parents with eyes that were cold enough to freeze water, the entire signing ceremony was filmed, in high definition, with 3 independent witnesses present, including a notary public and a federal judge who is a friend of the family. Arthur Silverton explains, in his own words, exactly why he is inserting the exclusion clause. He states, quite clearly, that he fears his son Richard's gambling habits and his granddaughter Blair's lack of moral compass. My father stopped mid-shout. His mouth hung open. The mention of gambling habits had struck him like a physical blow. He slumped against the railing, the fight draining out of him. Judge Harrison looked at the capacity report, flipping through the pages. He nodded slowly. The documentation appears impeccable, the judge said. He looked at Vance Sterling. Mr. Sterling, you are swimming upstream in a waterfall. Your client has triggered a self-executing disinheritance clause. The trust is valid. The capacity is proven. The assets are out of my jurisdiction. Vance Sterling looked at his client. Blair was staring at the table, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked up at Vance, her eyes pleading. Do something, she whispered. Vance, do something. I can't lose this. I leveraged the inheritance. If I don't get the money. Vance pulled away from her, physically creating distance between himself and the sinking ship. I need a moment to review the documents, Your Honor. You have had your moment, Judge Harrison said. And frankly, Mr. Sterling, looking at this file, I am beginning to wonder if you performed due diligence before filing this frivolous action. The judge turned his gaze to my parents, who were now huddled together, looking terrified. And as for you two, Judge Harrison said, his voice dripping with disdain, if I hear one more outburst, one more accusation of manipulation without a shred of evidence, I will find you in contempt of court, and you will spend the night in the county jail. Do I make myself clear? My mother nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying. My father just stared at the floor, defeated. I sat there, gripping the edge of the table. I looked at the old fountain pen in front of me. Grandfather had known. He had known exactly what they would do. He had built a fortress around me, invisible and invincible, and he had handed the key to a stranger in a black suit. But the stranger wasn't finished. Thorne turned back to the judge. Your Honor, while the trust documents settle the matter of ownership, there is one final piece of evidence regarding the character of the plaintiff that must be heard. It speaks to the intent behind this lawsuit. We object, Vance cried out, desperate. The case is over. You won. The case regarding the assets is over, Thorne said calmly, but the matter of the plaintiff's credibility is still relevant to the court's final written opinion. Thorne looked at me for the first time since he had entered the room. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something there. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. Play the video, Thorne said to the clerk. The courtroom was a vacuum, sucked dry of air and sound by the revelation of the trust documents. But Julian Thorne was not finished. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He gestured to the court clerk, a young woman who looked like she would rather be anywhere else on earth, and handed her a small, metallic drive. Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute attention without needing volume. The documents establish the legal reality, but the video contained on this drive establishes the moral one. It was recorded 6 months ago, on the very day Ms. Blair Silverton claims her grandfather was unable to recognize his own reflection. Judge Harrison nodded. Play it. A large screen descended from the ceiling to the left of the judge's bench. The projector hummed to life, a white beam of light cutting through the dusty air. Static crackled for a second, a harsh white noise that made everyone flinch, and then, suddenly, the room was no longer a cold, sterile box in downtown Seattle. We were in the library. My breath hitched in my throat. The image was high definition, startlingly clear. It was the study at the estate, a room I knew better than the lines on my own palms. I could see the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun that slanted through the heavy velvet drapes. I could see the wall of leather-bound first editions, the spine of the Melville I had restored just last year gleaming in the light. And in the center of the frame, sitting in his favorite wingback chair, was Arthur Silverton. He looked frail. His skin was like parchment, translucent and pale, stretched tight over the sharp bones of his face. He wore his old cardigan, the one with the hole in the elbow that he refused to let me throw away. But his eyes were blue fire. They were sharp, alert, and burning with a fierce intelligence that belied his physical weakness. But what stopped my heart was not seeing him. It was seeing what was behind him. In the background of the shot, out of focus, but unmistakable, was a figure sitting at the small work table in the corner. It was me. I was wearing a messy bun and an oversized sweater. My head bent over a stack of papers. I was completely unaware that I was being filmed. I was just there, working, being with him. I didn't know, I whispered, my hand flying to my mouth. I didn't know he was recording. On the screen, Grandfather leaned forward. He looked directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall, staring straight out of the past and into the guilty faces of the people sitting in the courtroom. Hello, Arthur said. His voice was raspy, the sound of dry leaves scraping together, but it was steady. If you are watching this recording, then I am dead. And if I am dead, and this video is being played in a court of law, it means my predictions were correct. It means that Blair and Richard have dragged my granddaughter, Wren, into a legal battle. He paused, taking a sip of water from a glass on the side table. He set the glass down with a deliberate clink. I know my family, Arthur continued, a sad, cynical smile touching his lips. I know the shape of their greed. It is a hunger that can never be filled. In the courtroom, my father shifted in his seat, his face a mixture of shock and indignation, but he did not dare speak. The judge was watching the screen with the intensity of a hawk. "Let us be clear about the history," Arthur said. "Richard, my son, you will claim I was manipulated. You will say I was weak. But do you remember the conversation we had 3 years ago when you came to me, asking for $2 million to cover your losses in that ridiculous cryptocurrency venture? You told me I owed it to you. You told me the company was yours by right." Arthur leaned closer to the camera. "I told you then that you had a gambler's heart and a fool's mind. I told you that you would burn through my legacy in a decade if I let you. You didn't visit me for 6 months after that, not until you needed another check." My father shrank into his suit, his neck turning a blotchy crimson. He looked around, terrified that the gallery was listening, but there was no one there to see his shame but us. "And Blair," Arthur said, on the screen. His eyes seemed to find my sister. Blair stiffened, her back rigid against the wooden bench. "My beautiful, ambitious granddaughter," Arthur said, but the words were laced with iron. "You treat people like accessories. Blair, you wear them until they are out of season, and then you discard them. Do you remember when you came to the house last year? You didn't come to ask about my health. You didn't come to bring me soup. You came with a lawyer." Arthur held up a finger. "You brought a competency hearing request. You wanted to declare me unfit so you could take control of the shipping logistics division. You thought I didn't know. You thought I was just a doddering old man staring at the fire. But I heard you in the hallway. I heard you tell your lawyer that I was taking too long to die." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a physical weight. Blair's face went from pale to a ghostly white. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream liar, but no sound came out. The truth was too heavy, too specific. "I am not senile," Arthur said firmly. "I am simply tired. Tired of being a bank account with a pulse. Tired of being valued only for what I can sign over." Then, the camera angle shifted slightly as Arthur turned his head. He looked over his shoulder at the out-of-focus version of me in the background. His expression softened. The hard lines around his mouth melted away, replaced by a look of such profound tenderness that tears pricked my eyes instantly. "And then there is Wren," he said softly, on the screen. The blurry version of me turned a page of the book I was reading. I looked peaceful, content. "Wren has never asked me for a single dollar," Arthur said, turning back to the camera. "Not once. In 5 years. She has never asked for a car. She has never asked for a loan. She has never asked for an introduction to a board member. Do you know what she asked for?" He chuckled, a dry wheezing sound. "She asked for glue, archival glue. She asked for humidity control units for the library. She asked for time. She asked if I wanted to hear the end of the chapter." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast. I couldn't stop them. I remembered those days. I remembered reading Great Expectations to him while the rain lashed against the windows. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because he was the only person who didn't look at me like I was a mistake. "Wren saved me," Arthur said. "Not medically, but she saved my dignity. She treated me like a man, not an asset. She listened to my stories not because she was mining them for passwords, but because she wanted to know who I was." He took a deep breath, and his voice became formal, authoritative. The titan of industry was back. "Therefore, it is my decision, made with full cognitive capacity and of my own free will, to designate Wren Elizabeth Silverton as the sole beneficiary of the sovereign trust. She is the only one who understands the value of what I built. She is the only one who will not sell it for a quick payout." "However," Arthur added, his eyes narrowing again, "I know you, Blair, and I know you, Richard. I know you will try to destroy her. You will try to use the law as a weapon to bully her, just as you bullied me." He leaned into the lens until his face filled the screen. "That is why I placed the assets in the trust. That is why I hired Julian Thorne, to protect Wren from you, to ensure that if you ever tried to take what is not yours, you would lose everything." Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper, cold and terrifying. Consider this my final lesson. Greed is a trap, and you have just walked into it. Do not test my patience. Even when I am dead, I have prepared for every move you could possibly make, and I promise you, I have more money, more time, and more spite than you can possibly imagine. The screen went black. For 10 seconds. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the hum of the projector cooling down. The emotional impact of the video hung in the air like smoke. It was a complete dismantling of the narrative my family had tried to spin. They had painted me as the villain, the manipulator, and grandfather, from beyond the grave, had revealed the truth. I was the only one who hadn't been playing a game. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, but the tears kept coming. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was relief. It was the feeling of a heavy stone being lifted off my chest. He had seen me, all those years, when I thought I was invisible. He had seen me. I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Blair was not crying. She was not looking down in shame. She was staring at the blank screen with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table. Shaking violently, it wasn't the reaction of a grieving granddaughter who had just heard her beloved grandfather's last words. It was the reaction of a con artist who realizes the mark saw through the con the entire time. "He played us," Blair hissed. Her voice was low, venomous. "The old bastard played us." "Blair, Axe," Richard whispered harshly, grabbing her arm. "Shut up." "No," she snapped, pulling away. "He set this up. He knew we would sue. He wanted to humiliate us." Judge Harrison slowly turned his head to look at her. His expression was one of profound disgust. "Ms. Silverton," the judge said, his voice icy, "I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent. You have just been impeached by the deceased himself, and frankly, after watching that, I am finding it very difficult to view your petition with anything other than contempt." Vance Sterling was frantically shoving papers into his briefcase. He looked like a man on a sinking ship looking for a life raft. "Your Honor, I need to request a recess. I need to consult with my clients regarding the new evidence." "There will be no recess," Judge Harrison said. "The evidence is conclusive. The testator's intent is clear. The capacity is established. The undue influence argument has been obliterated." I looked at Julian Thorne. He was standing by the clerk's desk, retrieving the drive. He turned and looked at me. His expression was still unreadable, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement. "He did this for you." The nod said, "And now I am doing it for him." The contrast was stark. On one side of the room, my family was disintegrating, consumed by the very greed grandfather had warned them about. On my side, there was just an empty chair and a man in a black suit, but I felt more protected than I ever had in my life. "Your Honor," Thorne said, breaking the silence, "the trust asks that the court move to dismiss the plaintiff's case with prejudice and to affirm the validity of the trust documents." "Wait," Vance cried out, a note of panic in his voice. "We have more evidence, we have financial records, we have—" "You have nothing," Thorne said, cutting him off. "You have a lawsuit built on lies and a client who just lost her inheritance because she couldn't wait for a funeral to be over before she started counting the money." My mother began to sob. It wasn't a pretty sound. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the lifestyle she had clung to for 30 years was gone. "Richard, do something. He can't do this. He's our father." "He was your father," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. My mother stopped crying and looked at me. "He was your father," I repeated, standing up. My legs felt stronger now. "But you never treated him like a father. You treated him like a bank. And now the bank is closed." Blair looked at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you've won, don't you? You think because you have some video, you're the special one. You're still nothing. Wren. You're still just the girl who hides in the library." "I would rather be the girl in the library," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "than the girl who sells her own family for a condo in downtown Seattle. Blair's face contorted in rage. She looked like she was about to lunge across the aisle, but Vance Sterling held her back. "Don't," Vance whispered. "You're already in enough trouble." The judge cleared his throat. "I have seen enough. The video speaks for itself. The documents speak for themselves. And Ms. Silverton." He looked at Blair. "Your reaction speaks loudest of all." He picked up his pen again. This time, there was no hesitation. "But before I issue my ruling," the judge said, pausing, "I believe Mr. Thorne has one more matter to address." Thorne nodded. He walked back to the table, opened the envelope one last time, and pulled out a single sheet of blue paper. "Yes, Your Honor," Thorne said. "We have discussed the assets. Now, we must discuss the liabilities." I frowned. Liabilities. Thorne turned to Vance Sterling. "You mentioned earlier that your client, Blair Silverton, has debts. You were more right than you knew." A cold chill went through the room. I didn't know what was coming next, but looking at the blue paper in Thorne's hand, I knew it wasn't going to be a video. It was going to be an execution. The blue paper in Julian Thorne's hand seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room, but before he could speak, the survival instinct of a cornered animal kicked in at the plaintiff's table. Vance Sterling, realizing that his legal strategy had been dismantled and his reputation was about to be incinerated, did not retreat. Instead, he lunged. It was a desperate, violent pivot. Vance grabbed a thick manila folder from his briefcase, a folder he had kept hidden until this very moment, and slammed it onto the defense table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, startling the court clerk and causing Judge Harrison to look up with a scowl of irritation. "Your Honor." "Stop," Vance shouted, his voice cracking with artificial outrage. "Before you rule on the trust, you must hear the counterclaim. We didn't want to bring this up. We wanted to protect the family's dignity, but if Mr. Thorne is going to play dirty, then we have no choice but to expose the truth about Ren Silverton." I stiffened in my chair. The truth about me. What truth? That I spent my Friday nights removing mold spores from 19th century maps, that I paid my taxes early. Vance waved a sheet of paper in the air. It looked crumpled, as if it had been salvaged from a trash can. "This," Vance announced, breathless, "is a promissory note signed by Ren Silverton 3 years ago. It acknowledges a debt of $2,500,000 owed to the Silverton estate for her education, her living expenses, and the professional training she received but never utilized." He threw the paper toward the judge. "She is not a beneficiary, Your Honor. She is a debtor, a massive liability. She owes the family millions, and she is using this fake trust to escape her financial obligations." I stared at the paper as it skidded across the mahogany surface of the judge's bench. It was a lie so bold, so fabrication, that my brain couldn't process it for a second. I had gone to a state university on a partial scholarship. I had worked in the library to pay my rent. Grandfather had offered to pay, but I had refused because my mother would have held it over my head forever. "That is a forgery," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "I never signed that. I never borrowed money from my parents." "Liar," Blair screamed. My sister leaped to her feet, abandoning all pretense of the grieving granddaughter. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure malice. The veneer of the successful CEO had dissolved, revealing the terrified, vicious child underneath. "You are a liar and a thief," Blair shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Tell them about the antiques. Ren, tell them about the silver candlesticks missing from the dining room. Tell them about the first editions that vanished from the library." She turned to the gallery, her eyes wild. "She is a kleptomaniac. She has been stealing from grandfather for years. She sells his things on the black market to fund her delusions. She is sick. She has paranoid schizophrenia. Just like her aunt. That is why she hid in that house. She manipulated a senile old man to cover up her crimes." The accusation hit me like a physical slap. Schizophrenia. It was the weapon they always kept in reserve. My aunt? My father's sister had struggled with mental illness her whole life, and my family had treated her like a shameful secret until she died alone in a facility. Now, they were trying to drape her tragedy over me like a shroud. "Order!" Judge Harrison bellowed, banging his gavel so hard the wood handle rattled. "Order in this court. Ms. Silverton, sit down immediately." "She is crazy," my mother joined in, sobbing theatrically from the bench behind me. "We tried to help her. We tried to get her treatment, but she refused. She poisoned my father's mind against us because she thinks we are aliens or spies. You cannot give her the money. She will burn it." The courtroom descended into chaos. My father was shouting about justice, my mother was wailing, and Blair was chanting "thief, thief, thief" like a mantra. Vance Sterling stood amidst the storm he had created, looking triumphant. He thought he had done it. He thought he had muddied the waters enough to delay the ruling, to force a psychological evaluation, to buy them time. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I looked at the judge. He looked overwhelmed. Accusations of mental illness and theft were serious. Even if the trust was valid, if the beneficiary was proven to be a criminal or mentally incompetent, the court could appoint a guardian like Blair. It was a brilliant, evil plan. And then, I looked at Julian Thorne. He was not shouting. He was not looking at the judge. He was not looking at Vance. He was looking at his watch. He waited exactly 10 seconds for the noise to reach its crescendo. Then, he moved. He did not slam a folder. He did not scream. He simply reached into that bottomless envelope and withdrew a second. Thicker file bound in black leather. He walked to the center of the room, ignoring Blair's screaming, and placed the file gently on the judge's bench, right on top of Vance's crumpled promissory note. "Are you quite finished?" Thorne asked. His voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. It wasn't loud, but it had a tone of such absolute, freezing authority that Blair stopped mid-shout. My parents fell silent. Vance Sterling froze. Thorne turned to me. "Ms. Wren, please forgive the noise. We expected this." He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, Arthur Silverton was a man who built a shipping empire by anticipating storms. He knew his family. He knew that when the legal arguments failed, they would resort to character assassination. He predicted, with almost supernatural accuracy, that they would accuse Ms. Wren of theft and mental instability." Thorne opened the black leather file. It was filled with spreadsheets, neatly tabulated and color-coded. "The accusation is that Ms. Wren stole antiques and books," Thorne said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let us examine the facts. 2 years ago, when Arthur Silverton transferred his assets to the Sovereign Trust, we implemented a protocol known as Total Asset Visibility." He pointed to the documents. "Every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, a sovereign auditor visited the Silverton estate. We cataloged every item in the house, every painting, every piece of silverware, every book, every rug. We have dated, time-stamped, and photographic inventory records for 104 consecutive weeks." Thorne picked up a specific page and held it up. "Here is the inventory from last week. The day before Arthur died, every single item listed in the original trust schedule is present and accounted for. Not a teaspoon is missing. Not a single page of a single book has been removed." He turned to Vance. "So, if Ms. Wren has been stealing for years, she must be a magician, able to replace the items with identical replicas every Tuesday morning before my auditors arrive." Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The promissory note suddenly looked very small and very silly next to the mountain of data Thorne had just produced. "As for the mental illness claim," Thorne continued, barely pausing to let them breathe, "we have Ms. Wren's medical records here as well, obtained with her consent during the background check for the trust beneficiary status. Clean bill of health, no history of psychosis, no history of medication. The only delusion she seems to suffer from is the belief that her family might one day love her." I flinched. That one hurt, but it was true. "But," Thorne said, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade, "since we are discussing theft, And since we are discussing the disappearance of valuable items from the Silverton estate, he turned slowly, deliberately, to face Blair. Let us talk about the fisherman at sea. Blair's eyes went wide. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. She took a step back, bumping into the railing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "Don't you?" Thorne asked. He pulled a photograph from the file. It was a grainy, black-and-white surveillance photo. But the subject was unmistakable. It was Blair. She was wearing sunglasses and a hat. But it was her. She was standing at the counter of a high-end pawnbroker in Vancouver, British Columbia. On the counter in front of her was a small, oil-framed painting. "3 months ago," Thorne narrated, his voice devoid of mercy. "November 14th. You told your office you were going on a yoga retreat. Instead, you drove north across the border. You took with you a small landscape painting by Thomas Looney, valued at $45,000. It had been hanging in the guest hallway of your grandfather's house for 30 years. You thought he wouldn't notice because he was senile. You thought the staff wouldn't notice." Thorne held up a second document, a bank transfer record. "You sold it to a private collector for $20,000 cash, a fire sale price. You needed the money to pay off the interest on a hard money loan you took out to cover your payroll." Thorne slammed the photo onto the plaintiff's table, right in front of Blair. "We knew it was missing the next day," Thorne said. "We tracked the sale. We recovered the painting. It is currently in the Sovereign Vault. We didn't press charges at the time because Arthur asked us to wait. He wanted to give you a chance to confess, to return it." Thorne leaned in close to Blair, invading her space. "He waited until the day he died for you to do the right thing. You never did." The courtroom was silent. This wasn't a legal argument anymore. This was a public unmasking. Judge Harrison looked at the photo. Then he looked at Blair. His expression was no longer just professional annoyance. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. "Ms. Silverton," the judge said, his voice low and dangerous, "let me understand this correctly. You just stood in my courtroom and accused your sister of being a thief. You accused her of stealing the very inheritance you are fighting for. And all the while, you knew that you were the one who had looted your dying grandfather's home." I, Blair choked. She looked at her parents for help, but they were recoiling from her. Even they hadn't known about the painting. They knew she was bad with money, but common theft. That was beneath the Silverton brand. "It was just a small painting," Blair cried out, her voice hysterical. "It was gathering dust. He didn't even like it. I needed the money. I was going to pay it back." "Admission of guilt," Thorne said dryly, looking at the court reporter. "Please ensure that is in the record." "You set me up," Blair screamed at Thorne. "You watched me do it. You let me do it." "We watched you make a choice," Thorne corrected her. "We watched you choose money over family. We watched you choose crime over honor. And today, we watched you choose perjury over silence." Vance Sterling was moving. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. The polished, confident lawyer was gone. In his place was a rat sensing the rising water. He was quietly, frantically shoving his papers back into his briefcase. He clicked the latches shut, snap the sound loud in the quiet room. He grabbed his coat. He realized, perhaps a few minutes too late, that he had not just lost a case. He had participated in a fraud. He had presented forged evidence, the promissory note, and suborned perjury. If he stayed, he wasn't just going to lose his fee, he was going to lose his license. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Harrison barked, "where do you think you are going?" Vance froze, one hand on the swinging gate of the bar. He turned back, a sickly smile plastered on his face. "I simply need to use the restroom, Your Honor. My stomach, the stress." "Sit down," the judge ordered. "If you leave this room, I will issue a bench warrant for your arrest before you reach the elevator." Vance slumped back into his chair, looking like a man awaiting the gallows. I looked at Blair. She was standing alone in the aisle, trembling, tears streaming down her face, real tears this time, tears of terror. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Ren," she sobbed. "Ren, please, tell them I'm not a criminal. Help me. We're sisters." I looked at her. I looked at the ivory suit that cost more than my car. I looked at the face that had sneered at me in the hallway 15 minutes ago. I remembered the years of ridicule. I remembered her telling her friends I was the help. I remembered her trying to put me in a mental institution just to get me out of the house. And I remembered grandfather's voice in the video. The best revenge is living well. But there was also justice. "We are sisters," I said softly. Blair's face lit up with hope. "But," I continued, my voice hardening, "you are also a thief, and you just tried to frame me for a debt I didn't owe to cover up the crimes you committed." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "I believe the trust has established the truth. I have nothing more to say to these people." Thorne stepped back to my side. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a shield. He looked at the chaos he had orchestrated, the exposed lies, the ruined reputations, the desperate family turning on itself, and he adjusted his cufflink. "The defense rests," Thorne said. But he wasn't done. I knew it. The blue paper, the one about liabilities, was still on the table. He had used the inventory list to parry their attack, but the final blow, the one that would bury them, was still to come. Judge Harrison picked up the forged promissory note Vance had thrown. He looked at it, then crumpled it into a ball and dropped it into his wastebasket. "This court," the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "has seen many things, but I have never seen a display of such naked, malicious greed. You didn't just want the money. You wanted to destroy this young woman to get it." He looked at Blair. "You wanted a judgment. Ms. Silverton, you are going to get one, but it is not the one you came here for." The blue piece of paper in Julian Thorne's hand was not an inventory list. It was not a will. As he laid it flat on the judge's bench, smoothing out the crease with a single, deliberate motion of his thumb, I realized it was an autopsy report, not for a body, but for a life. The courtroom had fallen into a stunned, fragile silence following the video of my grandfather. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a funeral. But Thorne was not interested in mourning. He was interested in dissection. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice shifting gears. Gone was the emotional resonance he had used when presenting the video. In its place was the cold, surgical precision of a forensic accountant. "We have established who owns the assets. Now, we must address why the plaintiff, Ms. Blair Silverton, was willing to perjure herself, defame her sister, and risk imprisonment to access them today. Specifically, today." Thorne turned to look at Blair. She was still trembling, clutching the edge of the table, her face a ruin of smeared mascara and panic. "It is not because of grief," Thorne said, "and it is not because of entitlement. It is because of a deadline." "Objection," Vance Sterling croaked. He was slumped in his chair, looking less like a lawyer and more like a man waiting for a bus to take him to prison. "Relevance. It goes to the motive of the filing," Judge Harrison snapped, not even looking at Vance. "Continue. Mr. Thorne." Thorne nodded. "The court is aware of Ms. Silverton's public persona. She is the CEO of Lumina, a direct-to-consumer fashion startup that has been lauded in the local press as the next unicorn of the Pacific Northwest. Her parents," Thorne gestured to Richard and Eleonora, who were sitting frozen on the bench, "have frequently boasted that Lumina is a triumph of modern commerce." My father sat up straighter, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. "My daughter is a brilliant businesswoman," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bluster. "She built that company from nothing." "She certainly did," Thorne agreed, "and she kept it as nothing, because Lumina does not actually sell clothes." A ripple of confusion went through the room. "Excuse me," the judge asked. Thorne picked up a remote control and clicked it. The screen that had just shown my grandfather's face now displayed a complex web of financial transactions. It looked like a map of the London Underground, but the lines were red and the stations were offshore bank accounts. We ran a forensic audit on Lumina as part of our due diligence on potential liabilities against the estate, Thorne explained. What we found was a classic layering scheme. Lumina has reported $12 million in revenue over the last 2 fiscal years. However, they have no inventory, they have no shipping manifest, they have no warehouse. The customers purchasing these high-end garments are all shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Thorne pointed to a large red circle on the chart. These shell companies are all traced back to a single entity, Obsidian Capital. Does that name sound familiar to you? Mr. Silverton. My father shook his head, looking bewildered. No, I don't follow the markets that closely anymore. You wouldn't find Obsidian Capital on the stock market, Thorne said dryly. You would find them in the files of the FBI's Organized Crime Division. They are a front for a real estate fraud ring operating out of Vancouver. They use Lumina to wash dirty money from failed development projects, making it look like legitimate retail revenue. My mother let out a gasp that sounded like a tire blowing out. That's insane. Blair, tell him he's lying. Blair did not speak. She was staring at the floor, her fingernails digging into the wood of the table so hard I thought they might snap. She cannot tell me I am lying, Thorne said, because she knows exactly what is happening tomorrow, January 30th. Thorne walked over to the plaintiff's table and placed a single sheet of paper in front of Blair. You took a bridge loan from Obsidian 6 months ago, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conversational volume that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. You told them you were inheriting $80 million. You used that promise to secure a loan of $5 million in cash to cover your personal gambling losses and the lifestyle expenses necessary to keep up the appearance of a successful CEO. Thorne checked his watch. That loan matures tomorrow at noon. If you do not pay the principal plus 20% interest by then, the default clauses kick in. And given who the lenders are, I suspect the collection method will not involve a polite letter from a lawyer. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at my sister. This wasn't just greed. This was survival. She had borrowed money from sharks, promising them a feast, and now she had nothing to feed them. She had come to court today not to win a fortune, but to save her life. You fool, my father whispered. The realization was dawning on him. You borrowed money from mobsters. I had to, Blair suddenly shrieked, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wild, bloodshot. The company was going under. I needed liquidity. I thought grandfather would die sooner. I thought the money would be here by now. You bet on his death, Thorne said coldly. And you lost. But that is her problem, my mother said, her voice trembling. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, instinctively trying to distance herself from the wreckage of her daughter. Richard, this is terrible. But, well, Blair is an adult. She incorporated Lumina independently. Her debts are her own. We aren't involved in this. She looked at the judge, putting on her best society matron smile. Your Honor, clearly we were misled by our daughter. We are victims here too. We had no idea. Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor. Oh, Mrs. Silverton, Thorne said, shaking his head. I am afraid it is not that simple. You see, Obsidian Capital does not lend $5 million to a failing fashion startup without collateral. Real collateral. He held up the blue paper. Blair didn't have any assets. She rented her condo. She leased her car. So, to get the loan, she had to provide a guarantor, someone with real property, someone with a portfolio. My father stood up slowly. He looked like a man walking into a firing squad. What are you saying? I am saying, Thorne said, that your daughter forged your signature on a joint and several liability agreement. Thorne walked to the gallery railing and handed the blue paper to my father. Here is the document, Thorne said. Dated August 4th. It guarantees the full repayment of the loan, collateralized by your personal residence in Queen Anne, your vacation home in the San Juan Islands, and your entire retirement portfolio. My father stared at the paper. His hands began to shake violently. The paper rattled like a leaf in a gale. "I never signed this," Richard whispered. His face turned a shade of gray I had never seen before. "This isn't my signature. It looks like mine. But I didn't sign this." "We know," Thorne said. "Our handwriting experts confirmed it is a forgery, but Obsidian Capital doesn't care. As far as they are concerned, you co-signed the loan. When Blair defaults tomorrow at noon, they will not just come for her company. They will come for your house. They will come for your boat. They will come for everything." The silence in the courtroom shattered. My mother screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a primal sound of pure material horror. She grabbed the paper from my father's hands, reading it frantically, her eyes darting back and forth across the lines that spelled out their doom. "You signed our house away," Eleonora screamed, spinning around to face Blair. "You signed our house away. I was going to pay it back," Blair yelled, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the snot and the makeup. "I was going to pay it back as soon as the inheritance cleared. I just needed time." "You stole our lives," my mother shrieked. And then, it happened. The veneer of the Silverton family, the polish of decades of country clubs and gala dinners and polite society, evaporated in an instant. Eleonora Silverton, the woman who had spent my entire life lecturing me on posture and decorum, lunged over the wooden railing. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a fury. She reached across the divider and slapped Blair across the face. Crack! The sound echoed off the high ceiling. Sharper than the gavel, Blair's head snapped to the side. A red welt bloomed instantly on her pale cheek. "You stupid, selfish little bitch!" Eleonora screamed, raising her hand again. "We are ruined. Do you hear me? Ruined?" "Get off me!" Blair screamed back, scrambling away, knocking over her chair. "It's your fault. You pushed me to be successful. You told me I had to be the rich one because Wren was a loser. You made me do this." "Order!" Judge Harrison was standing now, banging his gavel furiously. "Bailiffs control this courtroom." But the chaos had spiraled beyond control. My father, Richard, had turned his rage on the only other target available. He grabbed Vance Sterling by the lapels of his $3,000 suit and slammed him back against the defense table. "You knew!" Richard roared, spit flying into the lawyer's face. "You were her lawyer. You saw the books. You knew she was forging my name, and you let her do it." "I didn't know," Vance squealed, his hands flailing, trying to push my father away. "I was just outside counsel. I didn't see the loan documents." "Get off me. I'll sue you for assault." "I'll kill you," Richard shouted. "I'm going to lose my house because of you." The two bailiffs rushed forward, one grabbing my mother, who was trying to claw at Blair's hair, and the other wrestling my father off the terrified lawyer. "Let me go," my mother screamed as the bailiff restrained her arms. She looked at me, her eyes wide and manic. Ren, do something. Tell them you have the money now. Pay the debt. You can't let them take the house. It's your childhood home." I sat there, frozen. I watched the people who had given me life, the people who were supposed to protect me, tearing each other apart like wolves over a carcass. It was grotesque. It was a scene from a nightmare, lit by the harsh fluorescent lights of justice. "Ren," my father shouted, struggling against the bailiff's grip. "Don't just sit there. Help us. We are your family." I looked at them. I looked at my mother, her perfect hair disheveled, her face twisted in greed and fear. I looked at my father, a man who had bullied me for 20 years, now begging me to save him from his own golden child. I looked at Blair, huddled in the corner, holding her cheek, weeping not for the pain but for the loss of her future. And I felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. I felt a profound, aching sadness, not for them, but for the little girl inside me who had spent so long waiting for them to love her. I realized, with a clarity that was both cold and liberating, that I had never belonged to them. I was a stranger who had accidentally been born into a nest of vipers. They didn't see me. Even now, they didn't see me. They only saw a wallet. They only saw a lifeboat. "I can't help you," I whispered, though in the noise, no one heard me. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. Julian Thorne had moved. He stepped between me and the railing, placing his back to the chaos. He was a wall of black wool and calm authority, blocking my view of my screaming parents. He didn't look at them. He looked down at me. His eyes were dark, but for the first time, they weren't cold. There was a fierce protectiveness in them. He reached out a hand, not to touch me, but to shield me, creating a physical barrier between me and the toxic radiation of my family. "Look at me, Ren," Thorne said softly. His voice cut through the screaming, through the banging of the gavel, through the sirens that were now wailing in the distance outside the courthouse. "Do not look at them. They are the past. You are done with them." I looked up at him. My hands were shaking in my lap. "They're going to lose everything," I said, my voice trembling. "They lost everything the moment they chose money over you," Thorne said firmly. "Do not let their drowning pull you under. You are safe. I have you." Behind him, I heard the click of handcuffs. I heard Blair screaming my name one last time. "Ren, please." Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't move. He stood like a sentinel, keeping the horror at bay. And in that moment, beneath the glare of the courtroom lights, with my family imploding just 5 feet away, I realized that the man in the black suit was the only family I had left. The chaos that had erupted in the courtroom did not subside gradually. It was crushed into silence by the sheer, overwhelming force of judicial authority. Judge Harrison did not just bang his gavel. He struck the sound block with a violence that echoed like a gunshot. Once, twice, 3 times, until the vibrations seemed to rattle the very teeth in our skulls. "Enough!" the judge roared. His voice was no longer that of a weary civil servant. It was the voice of the state, thunderous and absolute. "Bailiffs, separate them. If anyone speaks another word out of turn, they will be gagged. I am not asking for order. I am imposing it." The 2 bailiffs, breathless and looking flustered, finally managed to drag my father back to his seat. He slumped there, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie askew, panting heavily. My mother was pushed back onto the bench, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she adjusted her ruined hair. Blair stood alone in the aisle, her cheek still red from the slap, looking small and terrified. The room fell into a silence that was heavier than the one before. This was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a tomb. Judge Harrison stood up. He did not sit back down. He towered over the bench, looking down at the wreckage of the Silverton family with a gaze that was cold, hard, and utterly final. He picked up the stack of files, the trust documents, the inventory lists, the forged promissory note, and the guarantee my father had denied signing. He aligned the edges of the papers with slow, deliberate movements. "I have heard enough," the judge said. "I have seen enough. In 20 years on the bench, I have presided over murders, racketeering cases, and violent divorces. Yet, I have rarely seen a display of moral bankruptcy as complete as what has transpired in this courtroom in the last hour." He looked at Vance Sterling. The lawyer was staring at his shoes, his face the color of old ash. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You brought a case before me based on a foundation of sand. You argued that Arthur Silverton was incompetent. You argued that he was manipulated. And yet, the only manipulation I have seen today has come from the plaintiff's table." The judge turned his eyes to Blair. She flinched, as if his gaze were a physical blow. "Blair Silverton," Judge Harrison said, "you came here seeking equity. You came here asking for what you believed was your fair share. The law is a precise instrument, Ms. Silverton. It gives, and it takes away." The judge picked up his pen. It hovered over the final order form. "It is the judgment of this court," he announced, his words ringing out clearly, "that the petition for probate filed by Blair Silverton is dismissed in its entirety, dismissed with prejudice. This means you cannot refile. You cannot appeal on these grounds. This door is closed to you forever." My mother let out a small, strangled whimper, but she clapped a hand over her mouth when the bailiff stepped toward her. "Furthermore," the judge continued. This court finds that the sovereign trust, established by Arthur Silverton on February 12, 2021, is valid, legal, and binding. The transfer of assets was absolute. The appointment of Ms. Wren Silverton as the sole beneficiary is confirmed. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It was real. It wasn't a dream. Grandfather had really done it. However, Judge Harrison said, and he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto my parents. We must address the consequences of your actions today. The trust document, which Mr. Thorne has so ably presented, contains a specific clause, Clause 47, the no contest clause. The judge picked up the trust document and read from it, his voice echoing in the stillness. It is my wish, the judge read, quoting my grandfather, that my son Richard and his wife Eleonora, and my granddaughter Blair, be provided for, despite their failures. Therefore, should they respect my wishes in this trust, the trustee is authorized to pay a monthly stipend of $10,000 to Richard and Eleonora Silverton and $5,000 to Blair Silverton for the duration of their natural lives. My father's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. $10,000 a month. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a lifeline. It was enough to keep the house. It was enough to pay the bills. He left us money, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. He left us a stipend. He did, Judge Harrison said. Arthur Silverton was a generous man. Even after everything you did to him, he wanted to ensure you were not destitute. The judge paused. The silence stretched out, agonizing and cruel. But, the judge said, and the word fell like a guillotine blade. The clause continues, however, should any of the named parties challenge this trust in a court of law, or seek to invalidate my wishes, or cause distress to the beneficiary, this stipend provision is immediately and irrevocably void. The judge looked at my father with a look of pitiless clarity. You challenged the trust, Mr. Silverton. You supported this lawsuit. You stood in this courtroom and called the beneficiary a thief and a mentally ill incompetent. You have triggered the penalty. No, my mother gasped. No, please, we didn't know. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, Judge Harrison said. And greed is not a defense. By the power vested in me, I hereby declare the stipend provisions void. The Silverton family, Richard, Eleonora, and Blair will receive $0 from the estate of Arthur Silverton. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. My father made a sound like a dying animal. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. He realized what he had done. For the chance of getting $80 million, he had thrown away the safety net that would have saved him. He had gambled the last chips he had, and the house had won. But the judge was not finished. Civil penalties are one thing, Judge Harrison said, his voice hardening into steel. Criminal acts are another. He pointed to the crumpled ball of paper in his wastebasket, the forged promissory note, and then to the file containing the evidence of the stolen painting. I am directing the court clerk to immediately transfer the transcript of these proceedings, along with all exhibits entered by Mr. Thorne, to the King County District Attorney's Office. Blair let out a sob. No, you can't. I can, and I am, the judge retorted. Ms. Silverton, there is substantial evidence here of perjury, forgery of a financial instrument, and grand larceny regarding the theft of the painting known as The Fisherman at Sea. You lied under oath. You fabricated debt. These are felonies. He turned his gaze to Vance Sterling. And Mr. Sterling, the judge said. Vance was shaking now, sweat dripping from his chin. You presented a document to this court that you should have known was forged. You failed in your duty of candor. You facilitated a malicious prosecution. I am hereby sanctioning you in the amount of $50,000, payable to the court. Furthermore, I am referring your conduct to the Washington State Bar Association for an immediate ethics review. I suggest you hire a very good lawyer, Mr. Sterling, because I do not believe you will be practicing law in this state by next Christmas. Vance closed his eyes. He knew it was over. His career, his reputation, his firm gone in an afternoon because he got greedy. Finally, the judge turned to me. His expression softened. The hard lines of his face relaxed. And for the first time, he looked at me not as a litigant, not as a variable in a legal equation, but as a human being. "Ms. Silverton," he said gently. I stood up. My legs felt steady now. I felt rooted to the floor, anchored by the presence of Julian Thorne beside me. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "The law is often a blunt instrument," Judge Harrison said. "It cannot fix a broken family. It cannot heal the wounds of the past. But it can protect the future." He signed the final order with a flourish of his pen. "You are hereby recognized as the sole legal owner of the Silverton legacy. The libraries, the archives, the charitable foundations, they are yours to protect. Your grandfather chose you not because of your blood, but because of your character. Do not let the actions of others change who you are." He handed the order to the clerk. "Ms. Silverton," the judge said, looking me right in the eye. "Justice has arrived late, but it has arrived." "Thank you, Your Honor," I whispered. "Case closed," the judge said. He banged the gavel one last time. The sound signaled the end of the legal battle, but it signaled the beginning of something else. As the echo of the gavel faded, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open again. This time, it was not a man in a quiet suit. It was chaos in blue uniforms. 4 officers from the Seattle Police Department marched into the room. They were not smiling. They moved with the grim purpose of men who had a job to do. The lead officer, a sergeant with gray hair and a stern face, scanned the room. My mother shrieked, clutching my father's arm. "They're here. They're here to arrest Wren. I told you she was a crook." Even now, in the face of absolute defeat, she clung to her delusion. She thought the police were her saviors. The sergeant walked past the defense table. He walked past me. He didn't even look at me. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table. "Blair Silverton," the sergeant barked. Blair looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to back away, but the railing blocked her path. Aye. "Stand up," the sergeant ordered. "What is this?" Vance Sterling stammered, trying to stand up. His instinct to defend kicking in weakly. "You can't just come in here." "Sit down, counselor," the sergeant snapped. "Unless you want to join her." The sergeant pulled a set of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted under the harsh lights. "Blair Silverton," he said, his voice loud enough for the gallery to hear. "You are under arrest for bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." "Identity theft," my father whispered. "What?" "We received a report regarding a fraudulent loan application with Obsidian Capital," the sergeant said, reciting the charges as he grabbed Blair's wrist, "and the forgery of a guarantor's signature. The suspect is considered a flight risk due to imminent financial collapse." Thorne had done it. He hadn't just reported the painting. He had reported the loan. He had called the police while we were in session, timing it perfectly. "No!" Blair screamed as the cold metal clicked around her wrists. "No, I didn't mean to. I was going to pay it back. Daddy, help me." My father stood there, staring at his daughter, the daughter who had forged his name, the daughter who had sold his house, the daughter who had just been handcuffed like a common criminal. He didn't move. He couldn't move. He was a man watching his entire world burn down. "Daddy," Blair shrieked, struggling as the officers pulled her toward the aisle. "Don't let them take me, Wren. Tell them to stop." The officers marched her down the center aisle. She was sobbing, hysterical. Her ivory suit rumpled, her dignity shredded as they passed the defense table. She twisted her body, lunging toward me. "Wren," she screamed, her face contorted with desperation. "We are sisters. You have the money. You can bail me out. Please don't let me go to prison. I'm sorry. The sound of her voice, raw and terrified, echoed off the marble walls. It was the voice of the girl who used to pinch me until I bruised, The voice of the teenager who told her friends I was adopted. The voice of the woman who tried to steal my grandfather's memory. I stood perfectly still. I felt Julian Thorne's presence beside me, solid and unyielding. "Wren," she screamed again, her voice cracking. "Look at me." I turned my head, but I didn't look at her. I looked at the judge's bench. I looked at the empty chair where Justice had sat. I looked at the American flag standing in the corner. I looked anywhere but at her. I heard the scuffle of feet. I heard the heavy doors groan open. I heard one final wailing cry of my name, and then the doors slammed shut. Silence returned to the courtroom. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 20 years. "It is done," Thorne said softly. I looked up at him. "She asked me to look at her." "I know," Thorne said. "I couldn't," I said. "You didn't need to." Thorne replied. He reached out and picked up the heavy black file from the table. "She made her choice, Wren, and you made yours. The difference is, you can live with yours." He gestured toward the side exit, away from where my parents were sitting, weeping into each other's arms in the gallery. "Shall we?" Thorne asked. "There is a car waiting, and there is a library that needs your attention." I looked at my parents one last time. They were broken figures, huddled together in the wreckage of their own greed. They didn't look up. They were too busy mourning the money they would never see. I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the family name, the expectations, and the pain. "Yes," I said to the man in the black suit. "Let's go home." The heavy oak doors of the King County Courthouse swung shut behind us, sealing away the smell of floor wax and the echoes of my sister's screaming. The silence that followed was instant and profound, like stepping out of a wind tunnel. Julian Thorne did not speak. He simply guided me toward the side exit, his hand hovering near my elbow without quite touching it, a protective ghost. We pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the Seattle afternoon. It was raining. Of course it was raining. But this was not the miserable gray drizzle that usually made the city feel like a wet wool sweater. This was a heavy driving rain, the kind that scrubs the streets clean. It pounded against the concrete steps and washed over the roofs of the cars waiting at the curb. It smelled of ozone and wet cedar and the cold. Sharp scent of the Puget Sound. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with it. It felt like the first clean breath I had taken in 5 years. "My driver is just around the corner," Thorne said, his voice low. He opened a large black umbrella, holding it high enough to cover both of us. "We will be out of here in 2 minutes. Wren. Wait." The voice was shrill, desperate, and terrifyingly familiar. It cut through the sound of the rain like a jagged piece of glass. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I wanted to keep walking, to get into the car and disappear into the mist. But the habits of a lifetime are hard to break. The reflex to obey that voice was etched into my bones. I turned. My parents were running down the courthouse steps. They looked nothing like the imperious, polished figures who had walked into the courtroom 2 hours ago. The rain was already ruining them. My mother, Eleonora, had lost a shoe. She was limping, her stockinged foot splashing in a puddle. Her hair, usually a helmet of hairspray and perfection, was plastered to her skull. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in black rivulets, making her look like a tragic clown. My father, Richard, was red-faced and panting. His expensive suit jacket was flapping open, exposing a sweat-stained shirt. He looked old. Suddenly, incredibly old. They reached us at the bottom of the steps, gasping for air. They didn't look at Thorne. They looked only at me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see authority in their eyes. I saw hunger. "Wren," my mother gasped, reaching out to grab my arm. Her fingers were wet and cold. "Thank God. We thought you had left. You have to help us. You have to stop this." I took a step back, moving out of her reach. "Stop what, Mother?" "The police," she shrieked, wiping rain from her eyes. "They took Blair. They took her away in a squad car like a common criminal. You have to call the district attorney. You have the power now. You control the trust. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we will pay back the loan." "We?" I asked. "The family," Richard barked, trying to summon his old bluster but failing miserably. "We are the Silvertons. We do not go to prison. Wren, it would destroy our reputation. Think of the scandal. Think of what people will say at the club." I looked at him. I looked at this man who had threatened to ruin my career in the hallway just an hour ago. He was worried about the country club. He was worried about his golf partners. He wasn't worried about his daughter sitting in a holding cell. He was worried about his standing. The reputation is already gone. "Richard," I said. I didn't call him Dad. The word felt wrong in my mouth, like a lie I was tired of telling. "And you don't have the money to pay back the loan. The judge just voided your stipend." My father flinched. "That is why we need you," he stammered, his voice dropping to a wheedling whine. "Wren, honey, listen, we made mistakes. We know that. We were hard on you. But we were just trying to push you to be stronger. We love you. You are our daughter. You can't let us lose the house. You can't let us starve. We are your flesh and blood." "Flesh and blood," I repeated. I remembered the time I had pneumonia when I was 16, and they left me alone in the house for a week to go to a wine tasting in Napa. I remembered the way they looked at me when I told them I wanted to restore books instead of marrying a banker disappointment so thick it choked me. "You had a choice today," I said, my voice steady against the drumbeat of the rain. "You could have stayed silent. You could have accepted the stipend grandfather left you. It was $10,000 a month. That is more than most people make in 3 months. It was a gift." "It wasn't enough," my mother cried. "We have expenses. We have mortgages." "It was a gift," I said again, louder. "But you wanted more. You wanted everything. And to get it, you were willing to destroy me. You stood there and watched Blair call me a thief. You watched Vance accuse me of being mentally ill. You nodded along. You wanted me locked up so you could cash a check." "We were desperate," my father pleaded. "So was I said softly. "I was desperate for a family, for 30 years. I looked at them, and I felt something shift inside me. The anger I expected to feel wasn't there. The hatred wasn't there. There was just a vast, gray exhaustion. They were not monsters under my bed anymore. They were just 2 sad, wet people who had spent their lives chasing a mirage. "You chose the money," I said. "You chose the money over your father. And you chose the money over your children. So now, you have what you chose. Let the money save you." "Wren, please," my mother wailed, sinking to her knees on the wet pavement. It was a performance, just like in the courtroom, but nobody was watching anymore. "We have nothing. The lawyers will take everything. Where will we go?" I turned to Julian Thorne. He had been watching the scene with the impassive expression of a statue, holding the umbrella steady over my head while my parents got soaked. "Mr. Thorne," I said, "do you have a recommendation for them?" Thorne's eyes flickered with something that looked remarkably like amusement. He reached into his breast pocket. He didn't pull out a checkbook. He didn't pull out a sovereign trust card. He pulled out a plain, cheap white business card. He stepped forward and handed it to my father. "This is the contact information for Mr. Gary Sinise," Thorne said smoothly. My father stared at the card. Confused, water dripped from his nose onto the paper. "Who is this? Is he a financial advisor? Can he stop the foreclosure?" "No," Thorne said. "He is a public defender. He specializes in bankruptcy and elder abuse cases. I suspect you will need someone with his particular skill set very soon. He is quite affordable. In fact, he is free." My father looked at the card as if it were a poisonous insect, a public defender. For Richard Silverton, it was an insult sharper than any slap. "You bastard," my father whispered. "Good day, Mr. Silverton," Thorne said. He turned to me. "The car is here." A sleek black sedan had pulled up to the curb. The driver, a large man with a shaved head, opened the rear door. I walked toward it. I didn't look back. I heard my mother crying my name again, but the sound was drowned out by the rain and the traffic. I slid into the back seat. The leather was soft and smelled of expensive polish. It was warm and dry. Thorne slid in beside me, and the door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, shutting out the world. As the car pulled away, merging into the traffic of downtown Seattle, I watched my parents through the tinted rear window. They were still standing on the sidewalk, two small, diminishing figures in the rain, clutching a soggy business card. Then we turned a corner, and they were gone. I let my head fall back against the headrest. I closed my eyes. My hands were shaking. "Breathe," Thorne said. His voice was different. The metallic, commanding edge was gone. It was softer, human. I opened my eyes. Thorne was watching me. He had taken off his wet jacket and loosened his tie. He no longer looked like the angel of death. He looked like a man who was tired. "Did I do the right thing?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the quiet cabin. "They are my parents." "Biology is an accident," Thorne said. "Family is a choice. They made their choice a long time ago. Ren, you just finally accepted it." He reached into a cooler between the seats and pulled out a bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to me. It was a small gesture, but it felt incredibly kind. "How did you know?" I asked, taking the water. "About the painting, about the loan, you had everything ready. It was like you could see the future." Thorne smiled. It wasn't the shark smile he had used in court. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "I couldn't see the future," he said, "but I could see the past. I spent 5 years watching Arthur Silverton. I saw how he thought, and I saw how much he worried about you." He looked out the window at the rain-streaked city passing by. "I wasn't just his auditor. Ren, I was his student." I frowned. "Student?" Thorne nodded. 12 years ago. I was a kid from the wrong side of Tacoma. My father was a dock worker who died when a crate snapped a cable. The company tried to bury the claim. They tried to leave my mother with nothing. He turned back to me. "Arthur Silverton owned the shipping line. He didn't have to meet with us. The lawyers told him not to. But he came to our house. He sat at our kitchen table. He didn't just pay the claim. He tripled it. And then he asked me what I wanted to do with my life." I stared at him. I had never heard this story. Grandfather never talked about his charity. I told him I wanted to be a lawyer so I could stop people like his lawyers from crushing people like my dad. Thorne said, "I thought he would be offended." Instead, he laughed. He told me the world needed more wolves who fought for the sheep. Thorne's voice grew thick with emotion. "He paid for my undergraduate degree. He paid for law school. He got me the interview at Sovereign. He never asked for repayment. He only asked for one favor." "Me," I whispered. "You," Thorne confirmed. 5 years ago, when he got sick, he called me. He told me he was dying. He told me he had a granddaughter who was brilliant and kind, but who was surrounded by sharks. He asked me to build a fortress around you. He asked me to be the weapon you didn't know how to be. Tears pricked my eyes again, but they weren't painful this time. "So when I walked into that courtroom today," Thorne said, "I wasn't just doing a job. I was paying a debt. I was protecting the only decent thing that man left behind." He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart stutter. "You are not alone, Ren. You haven't been alone for a long time. You just didn't know it." I looked down at the water bottle in my hands. I thought about the days in the library, feeling invisible. I thought about the nights I cried myself to sleep, wishing I had a brother or a friend. And all that time, Grandfather had been weaving a safety net, placing this man in the shadows to catch me when I fell. "Thank you," I said. It felt inadequate, but it was all I had. "Don't thank me," Thorne said. "Thank Arthur. He knew you would win. He just wanted to make sure you had the ammunition." The car slowed down. We were turning off the main road, driving through the iron gates of the Silverton estate. The rain was easing up now. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of pale, washed-out blue. The house loomed ahead of us. It was a massive, Victorian Gothic structure of stone and dark wood. For years, looking at it had filled me with dread. It had been a place of tension, of walking on eggshells, of hiding in the library to avoid my mother's criticism. But today, as the car crunched over the gravel driveway, it looked different. The windows weren't dark eyes watching me. They were just windows. The stone wasn't a prison, it was a shelter. The car stopped. Thorne got out and opened my door. I stepped out onto the gravel. The air was fresh and clean. The rhododendrons in the garden were dripping with rain, vibrant and green. I looked up at the house. My house. "It's quiet," I said. "It will stay quiet," Thorne said, standing beside me. "The staff has been instructed to deny entry to anyone without your express permission. The locks were changed this morning while we were in court. Security is posted at the gate." I took a deep breath. No more yelling, no more demands for money, no more sneers. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I hadn't looked at it since the trial began. The screen was flooded with notifications. I opened the news app. The headline was screaming in bold black text, "Fashion Unicorn Falls Lumina CEO Blair Silverton arrested in courtroom drama." I scrolled down. The article was brutal. It detailed the fraud, the fake customers, the mob connections. There was a video clip taken by someone in the courtroom gallery, probably a reporter who had snuck in. It showed Blair being led away in handcuffs, screaming my name. The comments section was already thousands of posts long. The internet, which had worshipped Blair as a girl boss icon just yesterday, had turned on her with vicious speed. They were dissecting her lies, mocking her outfit, celebrating her downfall. Obsidian Capital would see this. The creditors would see this. Her life as she knew it was over. She wouldn't just be poor, she would be infamous. I turned off the phone and put it back in my pocket. I didn't feel happy about it. I didn't feel a thrill of victory. I just felt a sense of completion. The tumor had been cut out. It left a scar. But the sickness was gone. "Are you ready to go inside?" Thorne asked. I looked at the front door. I remembered the day I walked out of it to go to the funeral, feeling like an intruder in my own life. "Yes," I said. "I have work to do. There is a stack of manuscripts in the West Wing that need to be cataloged, and I think I want to open the curtains." Thorne smiled. "Open them all. Wren, let the light in." We walked up the steps together. I didn't look back at the gate. I didn't look back at the city. I put my hand on the heavy brass doorknob, turned it, and walked into the warmth of my home. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the King County Courthouse slammed shut on my past. And in that time, the seasons had turned. The relentless gray drizzle of the Seattle winter had finally retreated, replaced by the crisp, golden vibrancy of July. The sky above the estate was no longer a suffocating lid of clouds. It was a sprawling canvas of impossible blue, stretching out over the Puget Sound. I stood in the center of the library, the room that had once been my sanctuary and my prison. It looked different now. The heavy velvet drapes, which had hung like shrouds for 20 years, were gone. In their place were sheer linen curtains that danced in the breeze coming off the water, letting the sunlight flood the room. The smell of stagnation and old dust had vanished, replaced by the scent of beeswax polish, fresh paper, and the salt air drifting in from the open French doors. The silence was different, too. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a house holding its breath, waiting for an old man to die. It was a productive, living silence. Down the hall, in the converted ballroom, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of pages being turned and the soft murmur of voices. The Arthur Silverton Center for Book Arts was open for business. It had taken 3 months of frantic work to navigate the zoning laws and the renovations, but with the Sovereign Trust clearing the path, we had transformed the estate into a non-profit conservation institute. We had 6 fellows in residence now, students from around the world, who had come to learn the art of binding, paper repair, and archival preservation. They were young, passionate, and loud in the best possible way. They filled the dining room with laughter during lunch. They treated the books with reverence. They treated me not as a weird recluse, but as a mentor. I walked over to the large mahogany desk, grandfather's desk, where I now worked. It was covered in stacks of grant applications and blueprints for the new humidity control system we were installing in the East Wing. Lying on top of a stack of invoices was a letter. It had arrived this morning. The envelope was plain white, cheap, and thin. The handwriting on the front was spidery and shaky. But I recognized the slant of the W instantly. It was my mother's handwriting. I picked it up. It felt light, insubstantial. I knew. In broad strokes, what had happened to them. I didn't seek out the information, but in a city like Seattle, news travels, especially when it involves the spectacular collapse of a socialite family. The foreclosure on the Queen Anne house had been finalized 2 months ago. Obsidian Capital had not been gentle. They had stripped the house of everything not nailed down before the bank took title. My parents, Richard and Eleonora Silverton, the people who had once looked down on millionaires as new money, were now living in a 2-room apartment in a dingy complex near the airport in Renton. My father was working as a greeter at a car dealership. My mother was reportedly trying to sell her old designer clothes on consignment websites. And Blair, my sister, was currently residing in the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. The plea deal her public defender had negotiated spared her a 20-year sentence, but she was still serving 5 years for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The Lumina scandal had become a case study in business schools on ethics and fraud. The internet had moved on to the next villain, but for Blair, the reality of a 6x8 cell was static and unyielding. I looked at the unopened letter in my hand. I could imagine what it said. It would be a mix of guilt-tripping and begging. It would talk about family duty. It would ask for a small loan, just until they got back on their feet. It would tell me that I was cruel for letting them suffer. I stood there for a long moment, the sunlight warming my skin. I thought about opening it. I thought about reading their excuses. Then I looked at the fireplace. Even in summer, we kept the grate clean and ready. I walked over to the hearth. I took a long match from the brass holder and struck it against the brick. The flame flared to life, orange and eager. I held the corner of the envelope to the flame. It caught instantly. The cheap paper curled and blackened. I watched the blue ink of my name disappear into ash. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt a profound sense of release, as if I were setting down a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for 30 years. I held it until the heat nipped at my fingertips, then dropped the burning remnant into the grate and watched it turn to gray dust. No contact meant no contact. I was not their savior. I was not their victim. I was just Wren. I always liked that fireplace. I turned around. Julian Thorne was leaning against the doorframe of the library. He was wearing a navy suit today, the jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose. He looked less like a corporate executioner and more like a man who was finally enjoying his job. "You're early," I said, smiling. "The board meeting isn't until 2. "I wanted to bring you this," Julian said. Walking into the room, he was carrying a thick, leather-bound volume. It came back from the binders this morning, the final restoration of the 1776 Atlas. He placed the book on the desk with care. He had learned a lot about books in the last 6 months. He spent more time here than he did at the sovereign offices downtown. He claimed it was because the trust required close oversight, but we both knew that wasn't the only reason. "Thank you," I said, running my hand over the new leather cover. "And thank you for handling the press yesterday. I really didn't want to do that interview." "The Times wanted a quote about the new scholarship program," Julian said, sitting on the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. "I told them that Ms. Silverton prefers her actions to speak louder than her words, and that she was too busy saving history to worry about her own publicity." "Perfect," I said. Julian looked at the fireplace, where the last wisp of smoke was drifting up the chimney. He looked back at me, his dark eyes searching mine. "Was that what I think it was?" he asked gently. "A letter from Renton." I said. Did you read it? No. Julian nodded slowly. Good. There was a comfortable silence between us. In the last 6 months, Julian had become more than just my lawyer or my trustee. He was my partner. He was the only person in the world who knew the entire truth of the war I had fought. We hadn't crossed the line into romance, not yet, but the air between us was charged with a quiet, steady potential. It was a relationship built on respect, on shared battle scars, and on the mutual understanding that we were both survivors. I found something else, I said, breaking the silence. While I was clearing out the bottom drawer of the desk for the new intern, I opened the drawer and pulled out a small, hardcover book. It was a copy of Great Expectations, grandfather's favorite novel. The spine was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. I thought I had cataloged everything, I said, but I missed this one. It was tucked way in the back, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. I opened the book to the title page. There, clipped to the paper with a rusty paperclip, was a folded piece of stationery. It's dated 2 days before he died. I told Julian. Julian stood up and moved closer, standing right beside me. May I? I nodded. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was weak, the letters trailing off at the ends, but the message was clear. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a codicil to a will. It was just a note from a grandfather to his granddaughter. I read it aloud, my voice soft in the large room. My dearest Wren, if you are reading this, then the storm is over. Julian has done his job, and the house is yours. I am sorry I had to leave you with a fight. I wished I could have given you peace while I was alive, but I knew that as long as I breathed, they would never let you be free. They would always see you as a barrier to my money. I know you, my dear. I know you will feel guilty when the dust settles. You will wonder if you were too hard on them. You will wonder if you should have saved them. Do not. They are adults who made their own beds. You are not responsible for their nightmares. I have spent my life building an empire, but in the end, none of it mattered as much as the quiet afternoons we spent reading by the fire. You were the only one who listened to the story, not just the ending. Remember this. The best revenge is not destroying them. The best revenge is living happily, successfully, and completely without them. Build something beautiful, fill this house with life, and never let anyone make you feel small again. Love, Grandfather. My voice caught on the last word. I traced the signature with my thumb. It was the closure I hadn't realized I was missing. Julian placed a hand on my shoulder. It was warm and solid. He was a wise man. He was, I whispered. He knew exactly what I needed to hear. I looked up at Julian. He told me to build something beautiful. You already are, Julian said, gesturing to the library, to the students working downstairs, to the sunlight streaming in. Look around you. Wren, this isn't a tomb anymore. It's a legacy. I wiped a stray tear from my cheek and smiled. He was right. I wasn't just preserving old books. I was writing a new story. I have one more thing to do today, I said, straightening my spine. I pulled a document from the folder on the desk. It was the finalized agreement for the Arthur Silverton Memorial Scholarship. It would provide full tuition and living expenses for 20 students from underprivileged backgrounds. Students like Julian had been to attend law school or art conservation programs. It was a commitment of $5 million. My mother would have fainted at the thought of giving that much money away to strangers. Blair would have tried to embezzle it. I picked up the old black fountain pen, the one I had clutched in the courtroom that day. It felt heavy and familiar in my hand. Are you ready to sign? Julian asked. I am, I said. I looked out the window one last time. The garden was bursting with color. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, blue and purple heads bobbing in the breeze. I saw a group of students walking across the lawn, carrying books, laughing. The estate was alive. I looked at the charred remains of the letter in the fireplace. That life, the life of fear, of scarcity, of begging for scraps of affection was gone. It had burned up with the paper. I looked at the document in front of me. This was the future. I uncapped the pen. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and permanent. As I signed my name on the line, Wren Elizabeth Silverton, I set the pen down. "Done," I said. Julian smiled. And this time, he reached out and took my hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Silverton. I believe you have a meeting to run." "Yes," I said, squeezing his hand back. "I do." We walked out of the library together, leaving the ghost of the lonely girl behind in the shadows. She didn't live here anymore. The forgotten girl was now the one writing the history of the Silverton family. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey of justice, please subscribe to the channel Blue Payback, hit the like button, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people.